Death of a Naturalist 1966 is a collection of poems written by Seamus Heaney, who received the 1995 Nobel Prize in Literature. The collection was Heaney's first major published volume, and includes ideas that he had presented at meetings of the Belfast Group. Death of a Naturalist won the Chumley Award, the Gregory Award, the Somerset Maugham Award, and the Geoffrey Faber Memorial Prize. Seamus Justin Heaney MRIA 13 April 1939 to the 30th of August 2013 was an Irish poet, playwright and translator. He received the 1995 Nobel Prize in Literature. Among his best-known works is Death of a Naturalist 1966, his first major published volume. Heaney was and is still recognized as one of the principal contributors to poetry in Ireland during his lifetime. American poet Robert Lowell described him as the most important Irish poet since Yeats, and many others, including the academic John Sutherland, have said that he was the greatest poet of our age. Robert Pinsky has stated that, with his wonderful gift of eye and ear, Heaney has the gift of the storyteller. Upon his death in 2013, The Independent described him as probably the best-known poet in the world. The work consists of 34 short poems and is largely concerned with childhood experiences and the formulation of adult identities, family relationships, and rural life. The collection begins with one of Heaney's best-known poems, Digging, and includes the acclaimed Death of a Naturalist and Midterm Break. In 2022, Death of a Naturalist was included on the Big Jubilee Read list of 70 books by Commonwealth authors, selected to celebrate the Platinum Jubilee of Elizabeth II. Death of a Naturalist, Summary. All year, the swamp near the town decomposed. Flax was rotting there, the heavy head of the plant still green, weighed down by huge balls of dirt. Every day it moldered under the hot sun. Delicate bubbles came up from the swamp and flies buzzed around, mixing sound and smell. There were dragonflies and butterflies, but my favorite thing was the warm, thick coat of frog eggs that lay in the shadow of the banks like clumpy water. Every spring, I'd fill jam jars with the eggs and leave them on the windowsills at home and at school, waiting and watching until they became quick, swimming tadpoles. My teacher, Miss Walls, told us how the male frog was called a bullfrog, how he croaked. And she told us that the mother frog laid hundreds of eggs, and that's called frog spawn. And you could even predict the weather from watching the frogs, because they turn yellow in the sun and brown in the rain. Then one day when the field stank of cow droppings in the grass, the angry frogs invaded the swamp. I came running there through the hedges and heard a loud, raw croaking I hadn't heard before. The air resounded with their deep voices. All the way down the banks, the frogs were sitting on lumps of earth. Their expanding necks were like sails filling with the breeze. Some of them hopped into the water. To me, the sound of their bodies slapping against the water was like a disgusting threat. Others stayed on the bank, sitting there like grenades made of mud, their square heads burping and burbling. I grew queasy. I turned and ran away. These kings of slime were gathered there for revenge, and I knew that if I put my hand into the water, the frog eggs wouldn't let me pull it out. Innocence and Experience. Death of a Naturalist is a poem about growing up, specifically, the fraught transition between childhood and adolescence. It describes childhood as a state of innocence and curiosity. The speaker gleefully explores the swampy, flax dam, and thrills in the creatures that live there, butterflies, dragonflies, and tadpoles. But, in the second stanza, the speaker's relationship to the flax dam and its creatures changes. They stop being enthralling and delightful, and instead become disgusting and frightening. This transformation serves as a metaphor for the transition from the innocent and unthreatening world of childhood to the disturbing, threatening world of adolescent sexuality. In the first stanza of the poem, the speaker reflects on what it was like to be a child. The speaker felt joy exploring the swampy, flax dam, at the heart of town. A flax dam is an artificial pond used to store and ferment flax. It's potentially a disgusting place, full of rotten, stinky flax. But the speaker doesn't seem bothered by the smell of the festering flax dam. Instead, the speaker loves to explore the pond and study all the different insects and reptiles that make it their home. Dragonflies, spotted butterflies, and the warm thick slobber of frog spawn. The speaker takes real pleasure in the clouds of fertilized frog eggs that hatch in the pond, capturing and studying them, watching them burst into nimble, swimming tadpoles. In other words, the speaker is fascinated with life itself, the natural rhythms of birth and growth. And that fascination includes, up to a certain point, sex. The speaker calmly repeats the teacher's explanation of frog reproduction, apparently undisturbed by it, though, of course, the teacher uses simple, childlike language to explain the sex lives of frogs. For instance, she calls them Mammy and Daddy. The speaker isn't threatened by sex for a simple reason: it's so foreign that the speaker doesn't really understand it. But, in the second stanza, the speaker's attitude toward the dam, and the animals in it, changes. Indeed, the dam itself has changed in important ways. There are more frogs, and they're louder and more aggressive. In this way, the poem suggests that time has passed, and in that time, the speaker has undergone an important transformation. Where the speaker once took pleasure in the frogs, now they're described as disgusting, foul-smelling, offensive. They are obscene threats, and the speaker emphasizes their capacity for violence. They are like mud grenades. As a result, the speaker, sickened, runs away from the flax dam. The speaker can no longer tolerate the smell of the place and the mess of the frogs who live there. Indeed, the speaker fears that, if I dipped my hand into the pond, as the speaker did without hesitation in the first stanza, the spawn would clutch it. This line is key to understanding the poem. The speaker is afraid of coming in contact with the frog spawn, and being tainted, or contaminated, by it. In this sense, the poem tracks a change in the speaker's relationship to sex, which is represented by the frogs. In the first stanza, the speaker regards sex with the innocent curiosity of a child. In the second, the speaker's attitude changes. Sex becomes gross and threatening. But the speaker can't go back and restore the uncomplicated joy of the first stanza. As the poem ends, the speaker is trapped in the world of adolescent sexuality with no clear way out. Human beings and nature. Death of a Naturalist is, in part, about the relationship between people and the natural world. As the title suggests, the speaker starts off the poem, at least metaphorically, as a naturalist, a kind of scientist who closely studies nature. The speaker thus feels separate from the natural world. It's something the speaker observes, not something the speaker participates in. But, as the speaker grows up, becoming an adolescent and learning more about human sexuality, it becomes clear that the speaker isn't actually separate from nature. The speaker participates in the same natural cycles that the frogs do. This realization is part of what causes the speaker's fright and disgust in the second stanza. The speaker wants to flee from the nature, to cease to participate in it. At the start of the poem, the speaker is someone who observes nature's rhythms and cycles with a clinical, scientific interest, or so the speaker thinks. The speaker describes studying the life cycle of the frog spawn in the pond, the way they move from egg to tadpole to frog. The speaker enjoys learning the details of this cycle, but doesn't feel particularly threatened or upset by them. This is partially due to the speaker's scientific attitude. The speaker is, metaphorically, a naturalist, someone who studies nature for scientific inquiry. This creates a certain hierarchy. The speaker is a scientist, and nature is the thing that speaker studies. They are separate from each other. That separation collapses in the second stanza. The speaker starts to personify the natural world more regularly. The frogs seem angry, seeking vengeance against the speaker for stealing their frog spawn. It's as if the natural world and the human world are blending into each other. Furthermore, instead of simply studying and observing the natural world, the speaker reacts to it viscerally and emotionally. It makes the speaker sickened, and the speaker runs away from the flax dam in horror. The speaker has ceased to be a naturalist. Indeed, the distinctions between the speaker and the natural world have broken down. This change is related to the broader transformation the poem describes, from childhood to adolescence, and from innocence to experience. As the speaker learns about sex, the natural world, with its cycles of birth, growth, and death, ceases to seem so distant, so separate. Instead, the speaker recognizes the way in which human life is also wrapped up in those cycles. Learning about sex doesn't just change the speaker, it also radically alters the relationship between the speaker and the natural world. Literary context. Death of a Naturalist was written in Ireland during the 1960s. Seamus Heaney, the poem's author, is one of the most important Irish poets of the 20th century. Over the course of his long and distinguished career, he won the Nobel Prize in Literature in 1996. Heaney worked to develop a distinctively Irish literature, a poetry that responds to the conditions of life in Ireland, that uses the kind of language that Irish people use, and that reflects the long tradition of Irish poetry. This poem was first published in Heaney's collection of the same name. Many of Heaney's poems, including others in this collection, also tackle the pain of growing up and display a deep respect for and connection to the Irish countryside. Blackberry Picking, for example, focuses on the childhood memory of picking berries only to have them quickly fester and rot. Both Digging and Follower explore Heaney's relationship with his father and to Irish farming traditions. The Scottish poet Carol Ann Duffy similarly looks at the fraught transition from childhood to adolescence, with a nod to tadpoles and frogs, in Mrs. Tilsher's Class. Death of a Naturalist is specifically rooted in Irish rural life, describing the Irish countryside in vivid detail, down to the way it smells. It also revives two traditional ways of writing that have been important to Irish poetry: the use of blank verse and the use of heavy alliterations. Blank verse was key in the development of English poetry and was used extensively by Irish poets like W.B. Yeats. However, by the mid-20th century it had largely fallen out of fashion. Alliterative meters, in turn, were key to the poetry written in England and Ireland before the Norman conquest in 1066 AD. The poem thus has unusual historical depths. Even as it describes scenes in the Irish countryside in the mid-20th century, it connects to poetic practices that stretch back into the Middle Ages. In this way, it suggests that the experience it describes, of growing up, becoming an adolescent, is universal, something that connects people across history.